Everyone out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and this is one of my graphic thoughts videos. This is where I go through all the different graphic novels I've been reading and give you my thoughts and opinions on them. Don't worry, there will not be any spoilers, but if you're at all worried about that, or you want to learn nothing about these books, or a book that you want to just hold off on hearing about, check out below. You'll see timestamps and chapters, and I'll give you the exact time I'll read each of these books. And let's get to the books we'll be talking about this week. First up, we have Covid Chronicles. Next up, we have Covid Chronicles. Lastly, we have the Incredible Nellie Bly. And when I do these videos, the first thing I try to do is seeing if there's any linking elements to any of the books. And of course, two of these books have the same exact title, so that kind of gives it away. But beyond that, I look at these books, and one thing I see is the attempt to find truth. And truth in what happens, truth in what people feel, truth in important topics. And we'll get to that and how each and every one of these kind of approach that idea. We'll start with Covid Chronicles, and of course, with a name like Covid Chronicles, you have an idea of what it's about. And there's actually a longer title. I guess a lot of people wanted to do a book about COVID, a comic book about COVID, and Covid Chronicles seemed like a good idea. The longer title, I apologize for reading this verbatim, but is The True Stories from the Front Lines of COVID-19, forwarded by Alyssa Milano. And Alyssa Milano does do a forward in this, and it's not her first time in the world of comics. I know she helped with that Hacktivist book from Boom Studios a few years ago. I don't know if she's done anything else, but she's not a rookie when it comes to the world of comics. She has a forward where she explains this book and kind of gets into COVID and her thoughts and her feelings and why this book exists. And this is written by Ethan Sachs with art by Dalibor Talajić, and colors by Loughridge, and graphic design and lettering by Bosung Kim. This is all, again, the same creative team that's throughout each and every page of this. The next book I'm going to talk about is very different than that, but this is, like the cover says, it's different stories about COVID, real life stories told in comic book form. Even in the back, they have like photos and more documentary elements to them to kind of explain who these people were, so you can kind of see the source behind the story that's being told. And the stories here do vary. For example, you have a reporter in Toronto that is covering COVID and ends up getting sick himself. You have a nurse who is helping people that are working on and doing things like the protests, trying to help them out, making sure that they feel safe and help lessen the spread of COVID. A doctor who's fighting COVID that gets COVID themselves. Those that are trying to track it, COVID in Seattle, to try to track the pathogens that, in an area that was specifically hit very hard. So you have a good, and then one of my favorite stories actually is this opera singer who is just kind of singing outside of his window during quarantine and kind of becomes a sensation. And then, unfortunately, obviously, it gets COVID as well. And then his story. So you have a combination of different stories from real life people from across the world and how COVID impacted them, or how they tried to fight it, how they tried to help individuals. And on the side of empathy, it's a good story just to get more context about what COVID was like on the front line. One of the biggest benefits of this, I think, is just context, right? Where we watch the news, we hear these different numbers, we hear what's happening. And as a person that's from the outside looking in, I have an idea of what I can imagine things are like, but this, I think, gives a better idea of what things were actually like for a lot of individuals and what they had to go through, just the trial and tribulation, just the sheer tragedy that took place. When you have a disease that's killing nearly 500,000 people in the United States and then worldwide far more, and just and then beyond the death, it's just the toll it takes on those that are trying to fight it, and the mental toll, the physical toll, those that do survive. So I could understand for a lot of people why they would have no desire reading this, because we're still very much within COVID. We're in the United States where I live, we're getting better, but you have countries like India that are being ravaged right now. So if there's one complaint, is that I do feel like a book like this can make COVID seem like a thing that's in the past and something we don't have to worry about moving forward, when of course I don't necessarily think that's necessarily the case. But I think as a tool of learning about it on a minute sense, on a personal sense, it's effective in that world. I know when it comes to like critiquing a book like this, things like good or bad, is this good or bad, feel a bit useless. Those are words I feel like seem inappropriate for this, because these are true stories, and true stories that certainly are ones that they can't control. But I think they did a good job in selecting the true stories, in the sense of getting good variety from them, making sure that you're not just focusing on one perspective in one world. It's not just United States. You get a global perspective. It's probably much more United States than the rest of the world. I'll say that, but at least it's not just that. And is this going to change someone's mind? Obviously, there's a lot of toxicity when it comes to COVID for a multitude of reasons. People rejecting science and all the fights over masks and things like that. So what I think a book like this can do is remind you that there actually are legitimately good people out there that go well beyond the norm to do their job and to help others and in whatever way they can. So in that sense, it does make you feel good. It's like, oh, wow, there are amazing people out there. Of course, on the other sense, you have people fighting this deadly pandemic. So it is emotionally taxing. So I could see why a lot of people would have zero desire to read this. Is this a book I'd say you have to go out and definitely read because it's going to blow your mind about what COVID was really like or completely change the way you viewed things? Not necessarily. I don't think that's the case. Anytime you try to write a story or do anything, create art about a topic that you're very much in still, you lack the element of perspective, right? Where I think, does this capture kind of just general zeitgeist and put it on the page? I think it is somewhat guilty of that. I'm glad that we are getting these actual real life stories, so I think that's where it helps lessen that. But I do wonder, if this was 5 years from now, would this be a much more powerful book because you had the element perspective? I think so. I also understand why they would make a book like this because people are interested now. Maybe 5 years from now, no one would want to revisit it because hopefully COVID is a story that is long and dead by that point. But who knows? So I do see a lot of benefits of reading this again through just learning that context. I think that context is important. But beyond that, it's a weird book to recommend or not recommend. I think ultimately, if it's something you're interested in or something that you want to learn a little bit more about, it's effective in that end. If you feel like just hearing the idea that this book exists will be emotionally taxing on you or something you want to avoid, I kind of understand that because I think that we are surrounded by it right now. And when you have something that is unable to inject any type of perspective, just because of the fact that we're still very much in it, I could see why holding off on reading it might be a good idea. So again, things like good or bad, like that type of critique feels like inappropriate for a book like this because this is talking about real life. When it comes to just the art on the page, the execution of the story, the design of it, it's effective. It does its job. It's good on that element. But at the end of the day, I'll say I'm glad I read it. Like, it wasn't a book where I felt like it was just trying to make me feel awful. Just the how the news will just kind of bombard you with awfulness. Like, there's things in here that are certainly sad. It doesn't try to shy away from reality, but I just think learning about people that are everyday people that are doing amazing things is something that there's always a benefit for, no matter what medium that you're reading it in. All right, let's get to the next book we're going to talk about, which is again COVID Chronicles. This is very different than the previous COVID Chronicles, where that was about with one creative team telling each story, real life events that took place. This is a multitude of different creators, different comic book writers, and you have stories in here that are based on, for example, a comic book creator that gets sick and gets COVID and his experience, but you also have just fictionalized stories as well. And then some are just like artistic expression, kind of letting out emotion on the page. It really varies. Like, variety is the spice of life when it comes to this book. There's a ton of different variety from different creators. The art styles vary greatly. Some are more realistic, some are more abstract. It's just, I think, to me, a good combination of the diversity that comics provides outside of the fact this is a story about COVID. Coming from Scholastic, you kind of understand that. I do think right now they are the most popular comic book publisher out there, so they do have a lot of fingers across the landscape of comics, and I think they brought them together for a book like this. Are there like names that are going to jump off the page of you? Not necessarily. These are a lot of creators that necessarily know a great deal of, but I did find just the ability to find all this talent was pretty impressive, because I think each story had its own flavor, had its own design, but most of them were pretty good. Again, it's hard to criticize this again because it's, again, an artistic expression about a global pandemic, and it's hard to say like, oh no, that was a bad story, or that drawing didn't make sense, or I didn't like the aesthetics of that art. It seems, again, a bit inappropriate, but I think the benefit of something like this compared to the other COVID Chronicles book is with it not based upon true life or true stories, it does open up the doors a little bit in the sense of you're not just being bombarded with this is sad news or just the depression state of the world. It's there as well. I mean, obviously these are people that are letting out their emotions. So you are going to get a lot of stories that are certainly ones that will hit you emotionally, but I guess maybe because they're based in fiction, most of them it's not as impactful or isn't going to bring you down as much. But I think on a sheer craftsmanship level, I did think this was a little bit better just through the sheer variety that's on the page. Not to compare them, but my personal experience was when I enjoyed reading more. I definitely think it was this one just because of the sheer variety and how you saw more room for expression because people weren't confined to reality. They can just kind of go above and beyond. And you have people here that are talking about the emotional aspect, people here talking about the political aspect. You have a scene in here, people letting out their frustrations with those that seem to do nothing but provide inaccurate information about COVID. This does feel like a very cathartic experience, and it was all put in a comic book form. So reading it, I think I could share in that catharsis, where with the other book, it was to me a story about empathy. Both to me, though, are getting to the element of truth, where that was more of a nonfiction truth, a reality truth about what really happened, to who it happened to, what was their real life experience like. Where this to me was more truth through the emotional sense. What were people really feeling? What are people really feeling now? How do they approach this idea? Like, where are they in a headspace? Like, that to me was more the element of how this was going through. And being Scholastic, of course, you think Scholastic, you think kids, because most of their books are directed towards kids. I don't know if kids would be able to read this. And there are some, not graphic sense, but I do feel like this is written more towards your adult audience, especially younger kids, like, middle school, lower than that. Is this going to make them better understand what COVID was like or anything like that? Again, not necessarily. This doesn't really have that much of a science angle. This is not seeped in reality. It's seeped in artistic expression. But maybe that is a way for them to learn more. I think it depends upon, obviously, the person and the way that you learn. Maybe you learn more through expression than you do through just your bare bones facts. I do think the other book is kid appropriate. Again, the stories here are hard to read at times just because of the emotional impact, but there's nothing in there I feel like would be inappropriate for a kid to learn. It might actually help them understand things more because of just the grandiose scope of how it's designed, and hearing some of those stories they may have heard about in the news, but getting a little bit more finer detail of it. So it is weird reading books about COVID when we're very much still in COVID, and obviously things are getting much better for a lot of the world, not all of the world. You look at India right now, and it's being ravaged by COVID. But I think this does give you some elements of hope. If anything, it just allows you to share in the experience that we all went through, to know that you're not alone in that. So there's some communal aspect to both of those. So again, I think at the end of the day, despite the fact that they are emotionally taxing, once you get through it and once you can kind of share into the benefits of it, I think at the end of the day, I did like reading them. But again, these are two books that I find hard to recommend, because I don't know if they're really going to add much more to the conversation that's already there. I understand why people would have no interest in reading these books, because we've been dealing with COVID for the last year and a half and continue to deal with it. So getting two books that just cover that topic, it may be the last thing you want to read. And I was there with you for a very long time, but I saw they were out, and I thought, I feel like I want to see, what are these books about? What do they entail? And I did find it interesting that they're both named the same things, but approach the idea very differently. But I think at the bright side, it does at least show you how diverse the comic book medium can be, taking one main subject, two books with the same title, but at the end of the day, they're two very different products. All right, the last book we're going to talk about shifts gears a bit, but it's also a book that is based in reality, and it's the Incredible Nellie Bly. And this was actually translated in English this year for the first time. And I picked this book for last because I knew it was going to be different than the other books, and also end on a little high note because I ended up really, really liking this book. And it's about the Incredible Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly was a real life person who you may actually know about her exploits even if you don't know the name. One of the most famous things she did was go undercover, trying to pretend she was mentally ill, to expose just how bad mental hospitals were. And she was successful in that. She was able to convince them that she was mentally ill. She got put in an institution, and she was able to see how bad things were from the inside. Unfortunately, there was a lot of horrible things that happened at that time, and it took some time for her to actually prove that she was mentally sane and was able to escape and kind of tell that story. And yes, this is a book that is, I think, generally designed for kids. I definitely think it's in the YA element, and probably more so middle school and older. I do think the way that they approach that subject, because it's part of the story, it's not the main story, had a level of tact to it, so you understood just how bad things were without getting the finer details. So you have a kid that you're like, I don't know if they want to learn about the exact things that happened to her. The way they approached it, I think, was actually pretty well done. But in general, the way it works is that you have this individual that is doing a report. She is doing a college project, and part of it is to interview Nellie Bly and learn about her story. And that's what she does after trying very hard, being rejected. Eventually, Nellie, who's quite older at this time, and she was around her 80s, sits down with her to have a conversation about her life and things that she did. And this young lady that's interviewing her is hoping to become a reporter herself, to follow in her footsteps, and they're having this great back and forth. I talked about how these books this week are all about finding truth, and that's the case here, of course, because that's what Nellie Bly was all about, was being a journalist to find truth in a situation. And she fought against a lot of oppression. A lot of people thought the idea of a woman reporter was absurd during her time. It was a rarity, but she fought against that stereotype to, again, get stories that no one else would. She had a number of supporters that did actually believe in her, and she went from a small town newspaper to a big city paper, and of course telling these stories. And then she's done things across the world. She went across the world on a trip to report things that she saw. She was all about trying to find the best story that she could, and find important stories to tell, even if people didn't believe that she could do that, and to break new ground. And it was incredible just hearing that story. And I think it, again, is well crafted, because you get the idea of just like how much impact she had on individuals. Again, this is the general story itself is, it's about her true life, but the design of the narrative it's false. It's not all true. It's based on a real story. Learning through this interview, this this conversation that they're having, and I do like the back and forth between them as they're kind of talking about what it means to find truth, what it means to be a good reporter, and just the way that you have to go about things when you're a woman in a world that doesn't necessarily respect women or welcome women with open arms, and what you had to fight through. It's absolutely incredible to learn, and I thought it was also a pretty well looking book. Colors are strong. It definitely has that YA feel. The context here, the design of the page is pretty straightforward. It's not trying to make things insanely crazy. It's just there to make sure that you understand the story relatively easily. So it's a good book to read if you're new to comics. It doesn't try to make things more complicated. The format is pretty straightforward. There's nothing here that is outside the norm when it comes to page design, which makes sense for a book like this. But I just thought it had a good story to tell. It covered a huge amount of ground, but did it very effectively. And just learning this information was fascinating to know. And again, I knew a little bit about Nellie Bly, again, mostly that experiment that she went through, but hearing her entire story, hearing what she had to go through, even learning that even when she tries to be the first person, sometimes people will try to steal her ideas. She tried to go across the world, be the first person to do it. But as she was doing that, there were other people trying to step into her footsteps and do it as too, the competition that would ensue. It was just interesting seeing that bit as well. And it was just a good palate cleanser for what I read last, to know that you have a book like this. And it's this is a new book, just came out this year. So if you're looking for something new, it should be in most bookstores. Again, I got this from the library. And if you do, I also really enjoy books about journalism and movies about journalism. So it really hit me there, because one of my all-time favorite movies is Network, which is very different than this. But again, it gets the idea of the power of the printed word, the power of news, and how it can influence us, and how this person, Nellie Bly, helped influence the world herself, how she was able to enact real change, and the sacrifices she needed to make in order to do that. Sacrifice, again, was another element that was kind of combined with all the books I read this week. That you did see that, of course, with the COVID Chronicles, the first book, seeing doctors and nurses sacrifice what they had to their own personal wealth, their own personal health at times, in order to ensure that people are safe when they need to be. When the other stories, the other COVID Chronicles, was similar in that, just seeing people had to do a lot of sacrifice as people were struggling. People losing jobs, losing their livelihood because of this virus and what they had to go through. And lastly, you have one that's very pointed, looking at a specific person, Nellie Bly, and the sacrifices she made, putting her life and her body on the line for a lot of her stories. And we were all able to benefit from most of those sacrifices in different ways. So yeah, a weird week of books for me this week, and I was happy to read this. I wasn't sure about it. I was like, I don't know, this looks interesting. The cover was not what I was expecting when you go inside. This doesn't seem like a cover about this person that is this powerful journalist that's going to change the world. You know, if you love Lois Lane and wanted to see a Lois Lane book, this is kind of that, but in real life. I don't know if Lois Lane had if she was impacted at all or influenced at all about Nellie Bly, but I could kind of see that because they do have that same like eagerness to get the good story, to break barriers. But of course, the benefit is that Nellie Bly was real. So there you go. All right. Well, that's it for me for this week. Thank you for checking out this video to hear my thoughts on all these books. Let me know what you thought of these books. If any of these books influenced you, check out the comment section below. Always, too, if you want to listen to Comic Concierge on the go, check out the podcast feed, Comic Concierge. It's there for you so you can download it. You can also follow me on Twitter at Concierge Comics or on Instagram at Comic Concierge. Anyways, I do appreciate you taking the time to check out this video. I know there are a ton of comic YouTube channels out there, so any view, any comment, anything like that, I always appreciate the time and effort people do in order to put those there. So thank you so much, and just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.